Professor Bueger, you're studying ocean infrastructures, and just last year you have co-authored an in-depth analysis of related security threats for the European Parliament. Thank you for meeting us here in Geneva.
It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Perhaps we don't always fully realize the extent on which our daily lives depend on infrastructure at sea. Could you give me a basic idea of this reliance?
Yes, infrastructures at sea are very often hidden and invisible, so we don't think about them too often. But let's start from the cloud. Right? We all put our pictures and our music in the cloud, but how do we actually access this cloud? It is through internet cables. And often our pictures and our music is stored in faraway data centers. So our request and our data actually travels through underwater cables. Think also about financial transactions. They are dependent on the cable. Or another good example are flights. If you want to book your next holiday to Seychelles, you better make sure that your request actually arrives in Seychelles. So a lot of our contemporary life is based on subsea data cables, and they transport about 95% of our data. The internet does not come from the sky, as many people think. Yes, satellites have a role to play, but almost everything is transported through these garden-sized cables on the ocean floor. But this is not the only infrastructure that matters. It is likewise electricity cables that are connected to wind farms. And let's not forget that if we want to reduce our CO2 emissions, then it is mainly offshore wind farming that can help us out. So that means ambitious plans actually to scale up offshore wind farming in areas such as the North Sea. So also our energy supplies will become more and more dependent on offshore infrastructures.
But isn't that a bit risky? We seem to depend on something that might be a bit vulnerable and complicated to protect.
Right, obviously these infrastructures are out at sea. The sea differs from the land. We just have to think about the weather patterns and the waves. It moves. And because of that, it is also much more difficult to actually protect and surveil them because they are out at sea. So we need to rethink of how we can do that differently from land. And often it is quite difficult to find out actually what happens at sea. It is an open plain, and there are not many points of orientation. There are no streets, there are no mountains, and so on that we could use to figure out where something precisely is happening.
So how big is the threat? Should we be concerned about our internet, our power, all other services that such infrastructure provides to us?
Now, cables, both data cables as well as electricity cables, they fail all the time. The sea is a harsh environment, so it happens on a daily basis that cables fail, and usually we don't recognize that at all because they're repaired relatively quickly. But now we are living in a different environment where these cables might be deliberately targeted. And that can be by adversary states, that can be hostile actions, and often this will not imply a full-fledged act of war that we actually know that the cable has been attacked. The Nord Stream incident is a very good example of that. We still do not really know who did it or how was it carried out. Now, this is the main threat, or these are the main scenarios that our infrastructures at sea will be attacked at a larger scale without us knowing who did it, how did it happen, and us lacking the capacities to repair it as quickly as we would need to. And for this, we basically need to think about alternatives and stepping up our game in protecting maritime infrastructures.
Some say the Nord Stream explosions were a wake-up call for Europe. Do you see a change of perception or maybe awareness of the threats here in Europe?
Absolutely, the cables are no longer invisible. We are now highly aware that an attack like this can happen, and that there's a likelihood that it will happen again in the future. And because of that, both the European Union as well as NATO has actually developed quite some plans in order to step up the game. But of course, we have to ask ourselves whether these are the right efforts or whether different things can be actually done. Much of what is currently happening concerns improving surveillance, us understanding better what happens on the sea, but also under the sea. But let's not forget, we are looking at large spaces. Right? So this is a massive task, actually, to have surveillance on all of the installations. So we need additional measures. For instance, we need to get better in monitoring what happens on the surface, whether there's suspicious activities. And we also need a very close cooperation between the industry and security policymakers and the military. Often civilian authorities also play a key role, the police and the Coast Guard and so on. Now, getting all of these actors together, right, agree on best practices, agree on who should do what, is not an easy task. And in the end, it is also a question about money. Who pays for all of that? Should it be the industry that, after all, makes money from these infrastructures? Should they harden the infrastructures or even employ private guards? We do that on land. Any nuclear power plant has private guards. Should we do the same thing at sea? Or is it largely a responsibility of states and the taxpayer doing that? Should it be the military and security agencies who deliver the main job on this? That's a debate that just has started, and it will occupy us for the coming years. I'm pretty sure about that. Overall, we have to get better in developing a systemic and holistic approach that looks at different components. And one of the key questions is also, how can we get better in ensuring that infrastructures are repaired as quickly as possible when they are actually attacked? That is a dimension that is often forgotten in the debate. Yes, we can prevent an attack to a certain degree, but what do we actually do if it happens? Exercises will help, but we also need to think about how to repair the infrastructure when it fails, what to do about it. And again, this is not necessarily a military task. It is more about having the right capabilities in place for repairing.
Professor Bueger, thank you for sharing your insight with our viewers.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.